So I'm sure you all recall the legendary man that is Robert Baratheon.
You heard the hand. The king's too fat for his armor. Go find the breastplate stretcher. Ow!
Which, if you haven't, you either live under a rock or haven't seen GOT. Which I don't know if it's a good or bad thing if you haven't, considering the final seasons.
Dany kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet and Euron's forces.
Anyway, the reason I bring up Robert is because this dude was legendary back in his prime time. This was the Demon of the Trident, and the face of a rebellion that reshaped the history of Westeros. But for all his greatness, all his strength, and meme potential, he was taken down by an overgrown pig. If that isn't humbling to someone or speak to our own mortality, then I don't know what will. Something I find funny though is that this isn't an isolated event with Robert. This same thing happens to someone else, but the events are 200 years apart, with two completely different outcomes. In GOT, Robert gets drunk, goes on a hunt, and gets a bit too close with the boar. In House of the Dragon, Rhaenyra goes on a hunt with her family for her brother's birthday, but feeling spurned by her father, she runs off with Criston Cole, and they get a bit too close with the boar. But unlike Robert, Rhaenyra actually comes out of this event relatively unscathed, thanks to Criston Cole and not being drunk. But what if she didn't? Boars in real life are pretty serious creatures. They do not play around, so it's not surprising that Rhaenyra struggled with one, and it wouldn't be unsurprising if this boar actually managed to take her out. So what would a timeline like that look like? What would happen to Criston Cole? How would Viserys react to the death of his first child? How would Alicent perceive the death of her once best friend? Before we get into that though, if you guys like what I have to say today, feel free to drop a like and hit that subscribe button for more videos. Now, let's get into it. So, today we wind the wheel back to episode 3 of season 1 of House of the Dragon. Alicent Hightower has married King Viserys, and today is the second name day of their first child and son together, Aegon. Despite today being a celebration, however, Rhaenyra is angry and peeved. She doesn't like that her best friend married her dad, and she definitely doesn't like that she has a little brother now. She feels betrayed by her father and friend for getting married after her mom died. She is angry and insecure because a son is what Viserys has always wanted for years, and now she feels like she can't match up to the infant Aegon, and that eventually he will supplant her as heir. Rhaenyra feels like she is alone and has no support, and this all comes to a head when Jason Lannister tries to put moves on the princess. She talks to her dad about it, and after an unproductive conversation, she runs off into the woods with Criston Cole. They have a talk about their respective places in the world and decide to get comfy by a campfire for the night. Then a boar shows up out of nowhere, and honestly, looking back at this thing was pretty freaking serious. It was big and it sent Criston Cole flying into the air. The idea of this thing actually taking Rhaenyra out is not that far-fetched. So in this timeline, instead of grappling with the boar, she gets gored by it. She's panicked, slow to react, the boar sticks her and gives her a nasty wound like Robert. Like canon, Criston Cole will eventually find his bearings and kill the boar and make sure it's dead. But it'll be too late. Rhaenyra will still be alive, but the damage is done. There's too much blood. The wound is too deep. So Criston, who is a frantic mess at this point, sheathes the sword, forgets the boar, and hurries back to camp with Rhaenyra as fast as she can to try and save her life. I think it's around this time in canon with Criston and Rhaenyra out in the woods that Viserys started to get vulnerable and emotional with Alicent, letting her know that he never expected to have a son, how he doubts choosing Rhaenyra as heir, and how he mainly named her heir out of guilt over what happened to her mother, Emma. So, in the middle of this conversation with Alicent comforting Viserys, Criston sees the bonfire and begins shouting for help immediately. He wastes no time notifying the king and queen that Rhaenyra has been injured. She's barely holding on to Criston on the horse. Her blood is soaking his shirt. Viserys and Alicent would be horrified and immediately begin to rouse the camp so they could get some help for the princess. Criston Cole probably would have grabbed his white cloak and wrapped it around Rhaenyra's wound in an attempt to stop the bleeding before they arrived at camp, but it's not helping much. Soon, everyone will be up and surrounding the royal family and looking on to the princess. Ultimately, it becomes evident that the wound from the boar is too deep and there is no saving Rhaenyra. Viserys would frantically say that they need to put Rhaenyra in a carriage and take her back to the Red Keep immediately. The people around him would try to dissuade the king from this and try to tell him that it's too late, but he'll be in denial because he refuses to accept the idea that he'll lose his daughter. daughter, the only thing he has left of his first wife, Emma. To make things even more tragic for Rhaenyra, she actually has last words for Viserys. She calls out for him, to which Viserys says he's right there with her. Rhaenyra struggles to breathe and says that she's scared, and then she dies. Viserys is distraught and once again says they need to hurry back to the Red Keep because he won't allow this. Rhaenyra's death would be a pretty heartbreaking thing, especially with that last bit I added. Her death would kind of mirror that of her mother's. They both ended up dying next to Viserys because of wounds on their stomachs. And Rhaenyra's last words were that she was scared. And before Emma died, she also told Viserys that she was scared. So seeing his daughter die in a similar fashion to his first wife would be even more traumatizing for King Viserys than her just dying in general. Alicent would be horrified at the death of Rhaenyra. Even though they were on the best of terms at this point in the story, and Rhaenyra pretty much hated her, Alicent still saw her as a friend. This is still her son's older sister as well. And in these early years, Alicent was a steadfast supporter of Rhaenyra and her claim to the Iron Throne, so much so that she defied her own father when he was plotting to make Aegon heir during the hunt.
Rhaenyra will be a good queen.
It wouldn't matter if she were Jaehaerys himself, born again. Rhaenyra is a woman.
I imagine the death of Rhaenyra would pretty much be a dream come true for Otto, since with her sudden demise, he doesn't have to plot or scheme to advance his grandson. Now that Rhaenyra is gone, without marrying anyone or securing her bloodline through children, Aegon is automatically the heir to the Iron Throne. So effectively, the Greens have won in this timeline without really having to compete for anything. But even with the ascension of Aegon, I still think Otto would be sympathetic towards Viserys and emotional about what happened. Despite how he seems, Otto isn't heartless. He does have love for people outside of himself. We see this with Alicent in the early episodes of House of the Dragon. But when it comes to emotions in comparison to his ambitions and goals, then that part of himself tends to take a back seat. Still, the point being, he knows the pain of loss. He felt it when his wife died, so he would definitely be sympathetic towards Viserys in this moment. It's also important to remember as well, at this point of the story, Otto wasn't fully out for blood and conflict yet when it came to Rhaenyra. Otto knew that Viserys loved and favored Rhaenyra, and him straight up choosing Aegon over her would be unlikely. He was still trying to make non-violent compromises too. He wanted Aegon to marry Rhaenyra when he was older. It sounds ridiculous given the age gap, but they both have very strong claims, as Rhaenyra is the named heir and Aegon is the expected heir with centuries of tradition and precedent to support him. Plus, Rhaenyra ends up marrying Daemon later, who is 16 years old when she was born, so Aegon and Rhaenyra eventually getting together is not that nonsensical. But I digress. After the death of Rhaenyra in the Kingswood, the royal family would go back to King's Landing and have a funeral for the princess. This would be a bit different from other Targaryen burials though. We saw in both seasons that Targaryens tend to be burned when they die. It seems the norm is to use dragons, at least that's how it seems in season 1, but with the death of Rhaenyra, her dragon Syrax no longer has a rider, and no one to give her commands. I mean, the Dragon Keepers are still around, and they can give dragons directions, but dragons can be a bit fickle at times with people who aren't their riders. So instead of dragging Syrax or some random dragon out to the royal family will light the pyre themselves for Princess Rhaenyra. This will be Viserys and Alicent, since she is her stepmother by marriage. Daemon won't be around at this point yet, so he won't get to participate, but as he finishes his war in the Stepstones with Corlys, he will eventually get the news of Rhaenyra's sudden death. There would be some pretty heavy ramifications with the death of Rhaenyra in this timeline so early on. For starters, this means that she doesn't get sent on her marriage tour around the kingdoms. This is somewhat important because this means that Willem Blackwood doesn't kill Gerald Bracken for insulting him in front of the princess. This also means that she can almost have an affair with Daemon, then have an actual affair with Criston Cole, and then be forced to marry Laenor Velaryon. This pretty much saves Joffrey Lamment's life because Criston isn't buckling under the weight of breaking his oath and then bashes in his face. This also saves Harwin Strong since he can't become Rhaenyra's lover and sire her bastards, so long Jace, Luke, and Joffrey, as well as her sons Aegon the Younger and Viserys, since she'll never get to marry Daemon, and if they don't plan to get married, then Laenor never has to fake his death in order to go and live a free life. But what are some more immediate changes that come as a result of Rhaenyra's death so early? Well, first is the fate of Criston Cole. Knowing Criston, he places a really high value on his honor, especially in Season 1. We see how breaking his oath gradually eats away at him at certain times, so the overwhelming guilt he must feel for failing in his duty to protect the princess must be insane. One thing I think is important to note before you render judgment is that this is Season 1 Criston. He's much younger and hasn't had years to stew in bitterness and resentment towards Rhaenyra with the help of Alicent. So you could say that his feelings are a bit more genuine here. I feel like Criston at this point, having failed so spectacularly, would ask to be put to death. It may seem drastic, but death is something that always seems to hover around Criston's character. In canon, when he gets caught by Alicent for sleeping with Rhaenyra, he owns up to it immediately, recognizing his transgression, and asks that instead of being tortured, they just put him to death instead. Then after killing Joffrey Lonmouth, he's so ashamed, his honor is so stained, that he tries to take his own life. Then in Season 2, he even says that dying would be a relief after everything he's seen. So Criston asking for death as some kind of penance for failing makes a lot of sense, and considering the emotional wreck that Viserys is in with the death of his daughter, the anger he may feel towards Criston for not saving her, he'll genuinely think about it. But knowing Alicent in the earlier seasons and how much more sympathetic she was, I think she would advocate for Criston Cole to be spared, and see the event for what it was, an accident. And that killing Criston won't solve anything or bring Rhaenyra back. It's at this point, I see Criston Cole just being stripped of his white cloak by Viserys and sent away to live in shame. I don't think he'd be sent to the wall or anything like that because it's not like he actually committed a crime. He didn't kill Rhaenyra himself, he didn't break his oath. Sure, he swore to defend her and failed, but it's not like he intentionally let her die. So him being stripped of his white cloak seems to be the most fitting. The death of Rhaenyra would leave Viserys as a shell of a man. He'd be miserable and melancholy and absent-minded most of the time. He feels like he failed. The whole reason he named Rhaenyra heir was to make amends for killing her mother Aemma. But now Rhaenyra is gone. She was his drive for a lot of things, and even with Aegon and Helaena still around, Viserys would be so lost and so removed from them because if we're being honest, in the show, Viserys does not love Alicent's kids the same way he loved Rhaenyra. I also believe that Viserys would blame himself for Rhaenyra's death. She only ran away into the woods because he was trying to force her to get married. He pushed her away, and then she died. Maybe if he'd been more understanding of her and hadn't been so persistent, she would still be alive. Once again, it's like a repeat of Aemma, how Viserys believes his obsession with his dreams and having a son is what really got her killed. By obsessing over getting Rhaenyra married, he pushed her away, and now she's dead. So he is on a steady decline because of this. Daemon will eventually return to the kingdom, but it's not going to be as happy of a reunion like it was before, as he returns with victory to the death of his niece and his brother deep in grief. Daemon's timeline changes a lot with Rhaenyra's death. As I said earlier, he can never marry her, and therefore Aegon the Younger and baby Viserys are never born. This also eliminates their escapade on the streets of King's Landing, so if that doesn't happen, Otto never catches them, never says anything to Viserys, and Daemon most likely never gets confronted by his brother in exile back to the Vale with his wife Rhea Royce. Seeing his brother so distraught and grief-stricken, I could see Daemon becoming a much more constant figure at court to the dismay of Otto, who was never dismissed as Hand of the King. Maybe he's even given a seat on the small council. In this timeline, I don't think it's likely that Daemon marries Laena. The only reason this was even able to happen is because Viserys exiled him to Runestone, where he killed his wife Rhea Royce. Then he met Laena when Rhaenyra and Laena were getting married, and took an interest in her, and he was able to pursue it since he was single now. If Viserys doesn't exile him, I don't think he puts himself in a position where killing Rhea is actually possible, since he prefers not even going back to the Vale in the first place and just sleeping around. Now, Daemon is somewhat close to the Velaryons, so maybe he could still take an interest in Laena, but since he's already wed, no one's gonna let that relationship fly if it even happens at all. And if I'm being honest, I don't see Daemon killing Rhea just so we can get with Laena. Not to mention, with his brother a wreck, I think Daemon would prioritize Viserys' well-being more than a potential marriage to a Velaryon. Also, another thing I could see happening after the death of Rhaenyra is that Viserys stops having kids with Alicent. Viserys didn't even want more kids, and he only remarried because he was pushed into doing so, and having more heirs was kind of a necessity for situations just like this where his heir died. I honestly think Viserys just tolerated having more kids because he had Rhaenyra, but now she's gone. I don't think Viserys could pursue having more kids without thinking of his daughter's death, and in some weird twisted way, think that he's replacing her. He'd be too much of a mental wreck to continue expanding the Targaryen bloodline. So this will erase Aemond and Daeron from the story. Aegon and Helaena will still be alive since Aegon was already born, and Helaena was about to be born at this point. Viserys would be an even worse father to them in this timeline, by the way. He barely paid attention to them when Rhaenyra was alive. Now that she's dead, I can see him just shutting down as a parent and barely doing the bare minimum at times for these kids. Because Viserys is on a decline, I also believe that the kingdom would start being mainly run by Otto and Alicent. Something that Daemon wouldn't be too thrilled about, but if we're being honest, they're really the only ones capable, and Daemon can't really try to frame it as them having some kind of ulterior motives, because what would they even be? Rhaenyra is dead, Aegon is naturally the next choice, and she has no heirs. Daemon would definitely try to convince Viserys to take control again, but he would be so depressed over Rhaenyra, it really wouldn't change anything. He would become a recluse and just leave everything up to everybody else in his court. Something else I could see happening in this timeline is that Aegon is not married to Helaena. I think Otto, who would definitely be in charge at this point, would understand how dangerous the position of the royal family is at this moment. They have been severely weakened. With the death of Rhaenyra, the only Dragon House Targaryen has to its name is Caraxes through Daemon, who is very unpredictable and doesn't like them very much. They don't have any others since Aegon and Helaena are too young. As a way to consolidate power, I believe Otto would try to mend the bonds between House Targaryen and House Velaryon by offering to marry Prince Aegon to Lady Laena Velaryon. Now, does this make sense and would it even work? Well, yes, actually. It makes sense because from a political standpoint, the Velaryons are more powerful than the Targaryens right now. They have Meleys through Rhaenys, Seasmoke through Laenor, and Vhagar through Laena. They also have a claim to the Iron Throne through Rhaenys as well. So to put an end to any potential conflict, I could see him organizing a marriage pact with the Velaryons. The age gap honestly wouldn't matter for Otto because, once again, he tried to betroth 2-year-old Aegon to 18-year-old Rhaenyra. So 2-year-old Aegon and 15-year-old Laena would not matter to him. It also wouldn't matter to Corlys. One thing I think some people tend to forget about is Corlys is just as ambitious as Otto. The only difference between them is Corlys is allowed to be more bold with his attempts at power. He has dragons, he has a fleet, he's the richest man in the kingdoms, he has nothing to hide. This is also the same guy who's willing to marry off his 12-year-old daughter to a man who was in his 30s so she could become queen one day and satisfy his own ambitions. It would be no different here, even if Aegon is a baby. At this point, Corlys hasn't gone through the humbling loss of both of his children. So he's looking for powerful matches. Right now, at this point in time, he's in talks with the Sea Lord of Braavos to marry his son to Laena Velaryon. But Aegon offers a much clearer path to power. As the heir to the Iron Throne, Laena will be his queen one day, and their kids will sit the Iron Throne afterwards. Corlys cares about having a legacy that will be remembered throughout history, and marrying Laena to Aegon is the most clear and easy way to make that happen, even if it means he has to wait a while. So this would most likely happen, to the dissatisfaction of Rhaenys and Laena. Another change is that Aegon would likely be a very different person in this timeline. It's easy to just write him off as terrible for the sake of it, but a lot of Aegon's character stems from the neglect and abuse he faced from Viserys and Alicent. In this timeline, he'll still be neglected, even more so than in canon, by his father because he's still haunted by Rhaenyra's death, but Alicent is different. In this timeline, she never had the chance to foster that hate and resentment with Rhaenyra for breaking the rules and disrespecting the laws of their society. She would probably be a better mother to Aegon because of this. She won't push her own fears and paranoia onto him, and probably wouldn't slap him around as much. Then Otto will also be there to give him guidance as well. Aegon would likely have a much more stable upbringing. He won't be raised as a tool to be used against his sister, so maybe this could facilitate some kind of positive change to his character. Something I think would be really heartbreaking though when it comes to Aegon's sister Helaena is if she ever tries to talk to her father Viserys, he mistakenly calls her Rhaenyra, like how we called Alicent Emma in episode 7 of the first season.
I'm going to bed, Emma. Shall I see after Queen Alicent, your grace?
Other than that, there don't seem to be too many opportunities for conflict when it comes to Aegon being king. The only opposition I could feasibly see is Daemon, since he hates Otto and will likely be fighting with him for control. And from what we saw in Season 2, we know he has some level of ambitions for the Iron Throne, and this could cause him to offer resistance against Aegon in the future. Maybe he thinks the Hightowers have too much influence and are ruining the Targaryen dynasty, and he needs to do something about it. But how he'll manage that with the Velaryons possibly backing them up is a different story if he goes that route at all. But this is where I'm going to leave the video today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, tell me your thoughts down below, and I will see you all next time.